stop for 1 second and look at the thoughts running through your head right now. Are you thinking in pictures, in sensations, in instinct? No. Most of the time, you're not thinking. You're repeating language that already has emotions baked into it. You don't notice this because it feels like your mind is private. It's not. For most people, consciousness is a playback system. Words trigger feelings. Feelings trigger decisions. Decisions harden into identity, and identity becomes destiny. Not because you chose it, but because you were taught the vocabulary of how to interpret reality. In today's episode, we're going to pull apart the most basic material behind your mistake: language. Not language as in communication, language as code, language as software. Language as a lever someone else can pull to move your inner world without your permission. Think of your brain like a biological computer. Language is the source code, and whoever writes the code decides what the operating system will consider normal, safe, rational, immoral, and possible. The cruel part is that the people controlling the code don't need to threaten you with a gun. They don't need to force your hand at all. They only need to rewrite the definitions you use every day. Once your definitions change, your perception changes. Once your perception changes, your consent becomes optional. Welcome to the Hidden Self, where we talk about the things society wants you to keep comfortably vague. The uncomfortable truth is simple. Language can be used to expose reality, or it can be used to override you. There is an old idea that if you know the true name of a thing, you gain power over it. You might dismiss that as folklore, fine, but psychologically, the principle is real. When you can name something precisely, you can relate to it precisely. When you can't name it, you can't fight it. When you don't have the words to describe what's happening to you, you will call the experience normal. And normal is where oppressors hide. Let's start with the covenant of the namers. If you look closely at how powerful institutions talk, you'll notice they never use raw, plain names for what they do. Raw names would produce discomfort. Raw names would produce questions. Raw names would produce moral clarity. So they avoid raw names like they're contaminated. Instead, they use euphemisms. They use clinical jargon. They use grown-up vocabulary that makes you feel like you're not qualified to understand. The moment you hear technical language, your nervous system does something. It backs away from certainty. It assumes experts are doing something complex, and therefore it must be legitimate. It must be too complicated for your anger. Here's a micro story that will feel painfully familiar to you. Imagine you check your bank account. You notice prices creeping up again. Food, rent, insurance, everything costs more, but your wage hasn't magically doubled. Your body feels the stress before your brain can build the narrative. Then you open the news and see a familiar sequence. A central bank prints money. They describe it not as theft, not as debasement, not as they're stealing purchasing power from ordinary people. They say quantitative easing. They say liquidity support. They say monetary expansion. The words sound neutral. The words sound technical. The words sound like a storm system in nature, not an intentional transfer of wealth. Your mind receives the euphemism and does emotional laundering. It washes away the moral judgment so you can't see the crime. If they called it what it is, you would understand this isn't some weather pattern. It's a system. And when people call it by a kinder name, they teach you to tolerate the outcome. You stop calling it robbery. You start calling it economics. And once you call it economics, you stop feeling like a victim. You become a participant, a stakeholder, a market participant. That is how they transform exploitation into a story you're supposed to live inside. Same mechanism with war. If you kill thousands of civilians, you will naturally create a moral alarm, so the vocabulary changes. They don't call it a war crime. They call it collateral damage. They don't call it choosing whose lives matter. They call it unintended consequences. Unintended is a magic word. It turns a decision into an accident. It dissolves accountability into fog. Here's the first brutal truth. You cannot resist what you cannot name accurately. You can't organize around vague suffering. You can't defend yourself against invisible mechanisms. You need language that points to the exact shape of what's happening. If the system keeps you from that, it keeps you compliant. And the most efficient tool for compliance is not force. It's confusion disguised as sophistication. So the euphemism is not just a cover, it's a psychological cage. Because once your vocabulary for oppression is taken from you, you begin to treat oppression as natural law. You begin to describe your cage as your environment. You begin to confuse the cage with the room. Then you stop searching for the exit. You just pace. Now let's go deeper, because there's another layer to this that hits closer to home. The higher the concept, the more it can be hijacked. Freedom, democracy, progress. These are sacred words. They feel too noble to be weaponized. But precisely because they are noble, they are perfect targets. When you can hijack a noble word, you hijack the emotions that would otherwise defend you. Start with freedom. In everyday advertising and consumer culture, Freedom becomes a menu. Freedom becomes a choice between brand A and brand B. Freedom becomes a subscription. Freedom becomes the feeling you get when you purchase a new version of something you didn't really need. They tell you freedom is the ability to buy whatever you want, but the psychological reality is harsher. Buying can feel like agency, but debt can be captivity. You can choose a product while your paycheck is already pre-allocated to interest. You can choose a lifestyle while your time is already sold. You can choose happiness while your brain is trained to chase dopamine on a schedule. You call it freedom because you use the word freedom, but the body experiences the chain. The mind experiences the contract. That is the trick. Language turns bondage into a feeling. Democracy works the same way. Many people think democracy is a system where the public has power, but in the language of powerful governments and their media ecosystems, democracy becomes a permission slip to intervene. The word democracy becomes a justification ritual. It becomes the moral garnish placed on top of resource extraction, market control, and geopolitical dominance. In other words, democracy becomes exportable. Democracy becomes something you can deliver, not something a population builds. That's why the word is used like a weapon, because it allows an external actor to act as if they are the moral guardian instead of the interfering party. Now, progress. Progress used to mean expanding human dignity. It used to mean fewer people suffering. It used to mean more access to education, health, safety. But today, progress often means the expansion of surveillance technology. It means more data extraction. It means fewer privacy boundaries. It means the monitoring of behavior, preferences, movements, and social connections. And if you challenge it, you get labeled. You become anti-science. You become against progress. You become the villain for wanting basic human dignity. That is newspeak logic. It's not an accident. It's a strategy. Redefine the moral terms so dissent feels immoral. If you can reverse meanings, you can reverse ethics. If you can take the word freedom and tie it to consumer debt, you can make exploitation feel like self-expression. If you can take war and rename it safety operations, you can make killing sound like housekeeping. People will absorb the new definitions until the old ones feel childish. And once the definitions shift, critical thinking doesn't get attacked directly. It gets drained because the system doesn't only control what you hear, it controls what you're allowed to think without social punishment. That's the Overton window in action. There is a range of opinions the culture considers reasonable. Everything outside it becomes socially expensive. If you step out of the window, you don't get refuted, you get erased. And the weapon for erasure is labeling. One of the most corrosive behaviors in modern life is how quickly people accept a label instead of evaluating an argument. If someone is extreme, you don't ask what they're saying. If someone is dangerous, you don't ask for evidence. If someone is antisocial, you don't ask what their data shows. The system trains you to treat the speaker as guilty by category. That stops debate from happening. That kills nuance before it starts. That turns your mind into a machine that reacts, not a machine that understands. This is why conspiracy labels became so powerful historically. If you can attach conspiracy to every question that threatens the official narrative, you're building a firewall inside people's brains. Once the label sticks, the brain closes. The brain doesn't need to engage with evidence. It needs to protect itself from shame, because shame is the strongest leash. Most people don't want to be wrong publicly. They don't want to be seen as irrational, so they self-censor. They suppress questions that could make them look naive. They swallow doubts and convert them into silence. That silence becomes obedience. And then you think you're independent because you still have thoughts, but your thoughts are filtered through the label system. You're not thinking freely, you're thinking within constraints you didn't design. Now here's where the trap becomes even more intimate. The system does not just label ideas, it also floods you with noise. In the past, control often looked like censorship, blocking information, rationing knowledge, preventing certain discussions. You could fight that by hunting truth elsewhere. You could seek alternative sources. You could build your own library. Today's control is often the opposite. Information overload, too much content, too many breaking updates, too many contradictions, too many headlines that demand emotion but never deliver understanding. Picture yourself standing under a waterfall. You can't drink it, you can't swim through it, you can't build anything with it. You only get knocked around by it until you stop resisting. Modern media works like that. Day after day, your mind is forced to ingest small emotional fragments. Crisis here, scandal there, threat somewhere far away, then a celebrity meltdown, then a political outrage, then a new outrage about the same outrage. Your attention is harvested. Your emotional system is constantly activated. And when your emotional system is constantly activated, your logic system becomes lazy. Logic requires space. Logic requires consolidation. Logic requires time to connect patterns and build models. But panic consumes time. The brain becomes a reaction engine, not a meaning engine. You see the tree, but you don't see the forest. You absorb events without integrating systems. You notice symptoms without seeing the mechanism. The result is psychological fragmentation. You end up feeling like the world is chaotic, unpredictable, and too complex to understand. That feeling is functional for the controllers. Confusion keeps you from organizing, and because you can't synthesize, you can't build a narrative that exposes the structure of power. You're trapped at the level of what happened today, while the machinery that shapes outcomes stays invisible. This is why modern language is so loaded with emotional verbs and extreme adjectives: terrifying, unprecedented, historic, catastrophic, outrageous, shocking. These words aren't there to teach. They're there to spike your nervous system. When your nervous system is spiked, you don't analyze, you react. And once you react, you become predictable. It's hard to notice this in yourself because you think the emotion is your own. You think your anger is authentic. You think your anxiety is evidence. But often your emotional intensity is simply the product of engineered vocabulary hitting a conditioned mind. Now let's land the plane with a different kind of programming: corporate language. If you work for a multinational company, you are programmed every day by a specific kind of speech. Corporate language. It might sound harmless. It might sound like professional culture. But psychologically, it does something very precise. It turns humans into resources. Notice the word resource. People become human resources. Your complexity becomes inventory. Your suffering becomes a cost. Your growth becomes a performance metric. Your value becomes a number. They don't call you a hired body. They call you a human resource. They don't call layoffs. They call them restructuring. They call it optimization. They call it adjusting scale. They call it realignment. Those words soften the cruelty. They make decision makers feel neutral. They make the people receiving the impact feel like they should accept it as inevitable, scientific, and beyond personal blame. That is cognitive anesthetic. Corporate language is full of phrases that feel like meaning but actually contain emptiness: synergy, breakthrough thinking, strategic vision, transformation. These words are often not describing reality. They are creating a mood. They are manufacturing a sense of mission. And once you adopt the mood, you stop asking what the mission actually serves. You start interpreting your exhaustion as dedication. You start describing your sacrifice as contribution. You start calling your manipulation engagement. Then our identity shifts. You become a project. Relationships become networks. Free time becomes recharge. Your life becomes labor optimized for someone else's balance sheet. This is the quiet violence of assimilating language. You don't get dragged into the cage physically. You walk into it because the vocabulary makes it feel like progress. And when language works like that, you also start to polarize. This is the part almost everyone denies, even while practicing it. You've probably noticed how modern discourse turns people into enemy categories. You don't encounter a human soul anymore. You encounter a role: villain, traitor, extremist, idiot, enemy, troll, conspiracy person. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you debated an argument without also making assumptions about the person's character? When was the last time you separated ideology from humanity? Most people don't. Most people are trained to treat disagreement as betrayal because the tribe needs enemies. The tribe needs someone to blame. The tribe needs clear sides so members feel safe, and language is the steering wheel for tribal instincts. If someone questions a policy, you label them as anti-science. If someone defends local culture, you label them xenophobic. If someone criticizes oligarchs, you label them a radical or a destabilizer. Notice how the labels are not arguments. They are emotional triggers. Once your brain hears a label, it enters battle mode. It switches from understanding to self-defense. It becomes fight or flight with a vocabulary wrapper. Dialogue dies because now you're not debating, you're defending your tribe. Here, diving us the uncomfortable truth. The reason powerful people love language wars is not just because they disagree with you. It's because polarization prevents solidarity. When people are divided into camps, they don't compare notes. They don't see patterns across issues. They don't realize the same mechanism is operating in finance, media, healthcare, education, and politics. Polarization is the glue that holds the system together. It keeps you fighting people who are also trapped. It keeps you angry at symptoms while the architecture stays intact. And that means the real enemy is not your neighbor's ideology. The real enemy is the shared manipulation of vocabulary that tells you how to react. Now we reach a turning point, because everything so far has been describing the outside world. But the real power of this episode is what it reveals about you. The matrix of language doesn't just exist in the media, it exists in your mind. Language sometimes doesn't reflect reality. It manufactures an internal reality. It builds a model of the world inside your skull, and then you behave according to that model. If someone else controls the words, someone else controls the mental map. And once your mental map is controlled, your attention follows the map. What you don't have words for, you don't notice. What you only have emotional words for, you only feel about, not understand. This is why the hidden self is hidden. You are not missing information. You are missing permission. Permission to name things precisely. Permission to feel certain emotions without shame. Permission to ask questions without needing a label to protect you from embarrassment. You might think you're independent because you scroll freely, watch freely, and hold opinions. But check the texture of your vocabulary. How many of your thoughts are made of slogans from headlines? How many of your opinions are recycled phrasing from films, marketing, social media scripts, and political talking points? You're speaking the language of the manipulators. And once you accept their language, you're living inside their dream. Their dream defines what matters. Their dream defines what's dangerous. Their dream defines what counts as common sense. And their dream is designed to keep you compliant. So how do you wake up? You can't stop using language. Language is your thinking tool. But you can stop being a servant of someone else's dictionary. You can regain authorship of your own definitions. Freedom starts there, not as a concept, as an internal act. Now let's do the part people love to skip. Practical dismantling. You need rules that change behavior, not just awareness. Awareness is cheap. Awareness doesn't restructure your reflexes. So here are 3 ways to break the language matrix inside your life. The first rule is to deconstruct every system term you hear like it's a trap, because it is. Whenever you hear a polished phrase from the media or from power, pause your automatic agreement. Don't let your brain